Hey,
Hey,
hello, and welcome to the Curious Kairos, the channel dedicated to those who desire to learn more about the timing of our Lord's return. I'm here today with two very special guests, and we're here to talk about uh, a very interesting passage in Hebrews 13. Um, you guys can, Amber, go ahead and introduce yourself.
Okay, you might want to take your overlay down so they can see us, because all I can see is the be right back.
Oh, I don't
Uh,
know. Let's see. How do I?
it should be under on the side where it says your media stuff. It should say something about your overlay.
See. We're at
On the um,
present.
it's yeah, you're still got your overlay up there. Under next to this the line where you hit your comments and stuff on the side part of your media files there will have where it says overlay, and then take that, just unclick the be right back, and it'll take that down so you can see it. But I'll go ahead and introduce myself while you're figuring that out. So yeah, my name's not yet. There you go.
there
All
we
right.
are.
How about that?
That's better. Now I can see everybody. That's better. All right. Yeah. So my name's Amber, and I have channel He calls me, and I'm also over on Unaltered, and
There we go.
and I am currently an Old Testament major at working in the Old Testament, ancient Near East Hebrew, and prophets are my favorite part. And because this is that Hebrews has a lot of the Old Testament, especially Leviticus in it, and I had a lot of fun talking about that. So he asked me if I do that, I was absolutely thrilled to come Leviticus in the book of Hebrews. So
All right.
that's about it.
All right, Phil. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah. Hey, my name's Phil Bray. I've got a YouTube channel, Leviticus is Fun, because I actually think Leviticus is fun. So I try and release short videos, 2 or 3 minute videos. So far, I think I've almost been going kind of verse by verse from chapter 1 and just hit kind of chapter 5 and 6. Yeah, been looking at Leviticus and ancient sacrifice and atonement for the past 6 years or so, to the point where I've written a book and got a book coming out later this year, which I'm very excited about. Yeah. So I'm a butcher. I'm a qualified butcher. So I've written a book from the perspective of a butcher. So basically Leviticus and sacrifice from a butcher's perspective.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
I love watching your videos. It's interesting how you can make Leviticus like so entertaining to learn about. Yes, a lot of people, I don't think they think of associate Leviticus with entertainment. Like something
Yep.
enjoyable to to learn about. But yeah, you make it very enjoyable, and I really really appreciate what you're doing.
Thanks. I try. That's the goal. Yeah.
All right. Well, let's just go ahead and get right into it. I'm going to go ahead and read um, Hebrews 13:10 to 16. Okay. Can you guys read that pretty well?
Mm-hmm. Looks good
Yeah.
over on my
Yep.
side. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So this is Hebrews 13:10 to 16. We have an altar from which those who serve the tent have no right to eat, for the bodies of those animals whose blood is brought into the holy places by the high priest as a sacrifice for sin are burned outside the camp. So Jesus also suffered outside the gate in order to sanctify the people through his own blood. Therefore, let us go to him outside the camp and bear the reproach he endured. For here we have no lasting city, but we seek the city that is to come. Through him, then let us continually offer up a sacrifice of praise to God, that is, the fruit of lips that acknowledge his name. Do not neglect to do good and to share what you have, for such sacrifices are pleasing to God. Okay. So what I would like to do is have Phil go first and kind of break down basically how he interprets it. And, he could focus, or actually, I'm sorry. I would like Amber to go first. Sorry, I think I might have taken those different.
That's
But,
okay.
but yeah, Amber, if you can go ahead and explain, like focus on the tabernacle a bit, and also give anything that stands out to you.
Okay, sure. The tabernacle is one of my absolute favorite topics. I really love the tabernacle imagery, and anytime you see tabernacle language, I always find that really, really interesting because there's a difference between the tabernacle and a temple. And the thing that distinguished Israel when God set them apart in the book of Exodus and gave them the instructions for building the tabernacle. One is like, to me, it's really fascinating because in canonical narrative, the area of study that I'm focused on, in storytelling, the majority of the thing that you give space to is the thing they want you to focus on. So Exodus is kind of this two-part narrative. First, you've got the Exodus story itself with this beautiful bridge with the Song of Moses that is kind of transitioning us into this new part. And then the second half is the story of how the actual birth of Israel takes place. And so you've got them at Sinai, and the first thing that happens is God, declares them holy, gives them Torah. But most of that narrative space in that back half of Exodus is the instructions for the tabernacle. So you start the tabernacle, you've got all of the rest of the birth of Israel and the giving of the Torah, and then you end with the tabernacle. So it kind of parentheses around. That's really important. And that is part of the setting apart, because in the ancient Near Eastern world, the temples were built at the center of everything on a sacred space. And that was, everyone would go to the deity, and it was made everyone focus in. But God separates himself there because he gives them a mobile space. So no matter where Israel goes, God goes to the people instead of the people coming to God. And it's such a beautiful picture that God, no matter where Israel's going in this journey, he's going with them in the middle of everything. And so I just love that we're pulling that imagery back in, and that it talks about the tabernacle, because it's not us having to go to God. God is coming to us. And to me, it's such a beautiful reminder that dwelling doesn't have to be in a specific location anymore. It goes back to God is dwelling with us instead of going out, with us where we are, instead of us having to go to a designated place. So, and then that, when you think about that too, in sacred space, that creates, everywhere the temple or the tabernacle went, they had to create a new sacred space because they had to dwell with God there, and God had to have his holiness demanded a place that had to be cleansed first. It had to be meeting where God could come. So there's all these instructions, and a lot of the part that hangs up people in some of Leviticus and some of the rituals and all of that stuff right there is the place that creates that space for God to be able to dwell with his people. It has to be a clean space. It has to be holy. You can't have sin. You can't have death. You can't have those things in the same space as Yahweh. So they're leaving this path that is creating a trail of sacred space as they're wandering around in the wilderness, which is fascinating because the wilderness is a place of wrestling. It's a place of death. It's a place of confusion. It's a place. So God's wandering around with his people in the middle of this mess, creating sacred spaces everywhere they go. And, it just, again, that's another one of those images that I just find absolutely beautiful, especially when we're in times of suffering and things are hard, that God has already shown us that he's in the middle of that, creating spaces to be with us in those times. So, as they're going around, the camp was laid out really specifically. So you have the tabernacle in the middle, because God's the center of everything. And then you've got the priests and the Levites, and then you've got the tribes that are on the four corners around the tabernacle, and that was the layout of the camp. But for animals to be killed for sacrifice, they went outside the camp completely, because the camp is the place of dwelling with God, and so you can't have death there. So they would go outside the camp. That's where the animal was humanely slaughtered. And Phil will talk more about this part, because he's more familiar with this than I am with that process. But then the blood was taken and brought in to be used, and then the animal was broken down, and what was not used had to be burned, or it had. Again, Philip's going to go into more of that. He's better at that than I am. But because we couldn't have death in the presence of God because of his holiness, it had to happen at a designated spot outside the camp. And so when you pull that imagery and looking at the book of Hebrews, it's very clear when it makes obvious it happened outside the city. Well, because the temple is there, the temple's in the city, it has to be removed from where God is, where people go to meet with God in the temple. It has to be removed outside. The death couldn't happen inside the temple because it would desecrate that sacred space, that meeting space, and we haven't had the transition to the church yet. There has been the resurrection in that imagery that he's talking about. So as he's explaining the story, then we get to this resurrection of Jesus, and that's going to move that in a different direction. But in your mind, you're thinking about this process and the offering that Christ gave on the cross. It has to be outside the city and outside of the temple, because death can't be in the proximity of the Holy God. So those are the things to me that really, really stand out in these sections, in that section of Hebrews there.
I like it.
So.
I agree. That vision of the tabernacle in the midst of the wilderness is a beautiful image. I don't know if you've heard about the idea of the concentric rings of holiness. So you've got the wilderness, which is like the chaotic place on the outside, which is a place of death and danger, and where jackals prowl and unclean animals and lions will kill you, and the enemies of Israel as well. But then you have all the tribes specifically camped around where God is living in the midst of his people. But the closer in you get, the more holy it becomes. So from the chaos death place, you have God's chosen people who are holy. But then you have around the God's dwelling place, you have the priests that live there, and they've got an extra level of holiness. And then you've got God's dwelling place. But even around that, you've got the outer court, and then the inner court, and then the most holy place right in the middle, which I love it. I think it's just a beautiful picture of God's desire to dwell within his people. But in doing that, it makes it makes them holy. But yeah, you just got this like an oasis in the middle of the desert. As far as one thing that I think it's kind of controversial, I guess, but the actual killing, like Amber said, the death is unclean. So if say a shepherd had a lamb that is an appropriate lamb to offer to God, but if that lamb died in the field, it's unclean and can't be given to God. And likewise, if that shepherd had touched that lamb after it was dead, he can't approach God because he is unclean. So there's something about a lamb being brought to God and being slaughtered that makes it different from a death that occurs elsewhere. But it just shows how unclean death was. So even a high priest couldn't be in the same room as a relative without being unclean. So death, and it's like a bit of an oxymoron, like death can't come anywhere near holy space, and yet they put animals on the altar. But actually, something I discovered as I was reading Leviticus and writing, an animal is never actually placed on the altar because the language changes. So animals are brought to the entrance to the tent and they're slaughtered outside. But after they're slaughtered, they're not an animal anymore. They're only spoken about as being an offering, and they're a holy offering. So it's almost like they're acknowledging that while death cannot come into God's presence, once the animal has been slaughtered, it's not a dead animal anymore. It's an offering and it's holy. And so then it can be put onto God's holy altar, which has been purified with the lifeblood of the animal. And then it can be sent up to God as a holy offering. Yeah, I can keep talking. But I think
Actually, I have a question. I don't want to sidetrack us, but that really brings up a question that I don't know, might or might not apply. But I'm curious, and Phil is sitting here, so I'm going to ask because it strikes me too that as part of priests not being able to be in the room in death when it's their turn to be serving and all of that, they're also excluded from being in the room when children are born, because for some reason there's this weird connection between birth, it's new life, but there's death involved in the process of birth. So it has to do with the blood and the blood that's not alive anymore, with that whole imagery and why the cleansing has to happen in the separation that is not being in the presence of death and bringing that peace with it, which again, I probably sidetracked this, but it's been wondering about.
I'm not convinced that all uncleanliness was death related. I know Bible Project and Tim Mackey kind of suggest that, but I'm not sure that childbirth is unclean because it's death related, because you've also got, if a man has an emission, he's unclean, or if they eat the wrong kind of food, they're unclean. I see it more as the boundary of it's outside of God's created order. So if my favorite analogy is like a crab or something that does it dwell in the water or on the land? So it's unclean because it's either emerged from its home in the ocean and has come onto the land, or it's a land creature that is living in the water. But either way, it's unclean because it's not in its appropriate space. And I think that's why maybe snakes and scorpions are unclean, because they live under the ground, but when they're on the ground, it's bad news because they'll bite you and kill you. And similarly, I think things like skin disease or leprosy, or mold in a house, like mold doesn't belong in a house. It's outside of its proper domain. And I wonder whether childbirth or menstruation or sexual emissions or something are outside of their proper domain. So maybe God's just showing that the pain experienced during childbirth is not God's ideal, and the loss of blood during childbirth is not God's ideal. So there's something outside of God's good ordered creation that we can hope that when we are dwelling with him in his tabernacle, in the heavenly temple, that all that stuff that at the moment seems to be outside of its ideal space, that it won't be outside of its ideal space anymore, that everything will be made right and completed.
You and I can have that debate when we get to part 2 of why Leviticus matters, and we'll get back to Hebrews here.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. What I wanted to say is Hebrews talks. I think Hebrews is very intentional about associating what Jesus does with his work in the heavenly spaces. So when Hebrews uses sacrificial language, it's Jesus presenting his blood in the heavenly space rather than his death. Oh, have we lost Amber?
I'll be right back. Yeah, hang on.
Yeah, right. So, like I was saying before, that if death is unclean, then it wouldn't make much sense to talk about Jesus' suffering and death as the sacrifice that God wanted. Because another thing is the animal didn't suffer. It wasn't violently killed. It wasn't beaten. It was slaughtered in as humane a way as possible. So whenever you read about Jesus' sufferings, which we'll get to in Hebrews, I don't think that they're talking about that as a good thing. That is a good part of a sacrifice. I think they're distinct. And I think maybe that's why the language is outside the camp. Because the thing that Jesus did as an unblemished life, and presenting himself to God, and then as high priest, is also the language of Hebrews. It's more about what Jesus did in his life was pleasing and acceptable to God, but the death and the suffering, I think maybe they look back and say, well, this fits the mold of a sacrifice, but actually it's not what pleased God so much as Jesus' blameless, unblemished life.
Yeah, because wouldn't the suffering and the death would taint the offering itself, and then it wouldn't be able to be made.
And then it would be unclean. Yeah.
Are there like Hebrews 13, I believe, verse 14, or let's see here, or 13. Let's see, it's therefore let us go to him outside the camp, or actually verse 12. So Jesus also suffered outside the gate in order to sanctify the people through his blood. Or and verse 11 talks about for sin are burned outside the camp. So it seems to be kind of equating or comparing Jesus's death to like a burnt offering. The burnt offering was the whole offering to God. Are there any other verses that make that comparison of Jesus and the burnt offering?
So yes, and I've got one bookmarked. So it could be a burnt offering in Hebrews. I don't think it is.
Okay.
It could be the scapegoat, because that was sent outside the camp. That's possible, but I think that it is the sin offering, which was specifically burned outside the camp, like Amber said. Do you want to talk about the burnt offering first?
Yeah.
Let's do that quickly. So Ephesians, I've got it bookmarked. I'm heaped prepared. Ephesians 5, what is it? 5:2. I'll start at verse 1. It says, "Be imitators of God, therefore, as dearly beloved children, and live a life of love, just as Christ loved us and gave himself up for us as a fragrant offering and sacrifice to God." So the burnt offering was given all up to God, the whole thing. The priest and the people didn't get any of that. And it was sent. So the burnt offering is, and Amber knows more than me, but olah, which is going upwards. The idea is that as the smoke ascends, it's being sent upwards into the divine realm of where they imagined that God was living. And so and again, this to my point that death, Jesus is rarely, or maybe never, his death isn't spoken about as a sacrifice so much as his action, if that makes sense. So even here where it says that he loved us and gave himself up for us as a fragrant offering and sacrifice to God, that comes after verse 1, which is be imitators of God as dearly loved children. So I think it's the loving action of Jesus, who gave himself, submitted himself to death, and then was killed. And then God accepts that as a fragrant offering, because that is the ultimate expression of love. But I love how it says, gave himself up, because that fits with the burnt offering of giving, not giving up to like go without, but giving upwards. So you're offering upwards to God something that is a pleasing aroma. So I think we need to remember that sacrifice it remained holy all the way, and it was a pleasing aroma to God. So it can't be contaminated with suffering or with sin or anything like that. So whenever Jesus is conceptualized as an offering, it must be as blameless, must be as a pure, holy, unblemished offering. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and even verse 7 in Hebrews 13 talks about imitate their faith, because and it's in reference to remember the outcome of their life, of the leaders that had taught them. Well, what was the outcome of their life? Like, you know, I'm not too sure exactly when Hebrews was written, but I would presume that it's referring to the outcome of their life was martyrdom. Do you think that that's accurate, or do you think it could be talking about something else?
I don't know. I'll be honest. I haven't thought about that one.
Kind of outside my realm of. I would give 13 verse 11 is really interesting because he makes it point out. It makes out purposely pointing out for the bodies of those animals whose blood is brought into the holy place by the high priest as an offering for sin. Those bodies are burned outside the camp. That's exactly what verse 11 says. So it's very much bringing attention to the blood, which blood is life in the Old Testament. Blood is the life thing. That's where spilling of blood gets you in big trouble when like you take the life of someone else. And there's also this. I want to go back. It's on my list of things to do. I want to do a video connecting the difference or the connection between the nephesh and blood, because there is a connection there, but I haven't quite untangled all of exactly what that is. But there's this fascinating, anyway, too sidetracked on that either, but yeah, they make Hebrews is pretty clear, and the Old Testament is pretty clear that the blood is the important part of a lot of those sacrifices, those animal offerings that are brought. There's some of the best parts, which I know, Phil, I don't know. I'm wondering about this because the pieces that are brought are things like the heart or the kidneys, the parts that are the best parts of the animal. That's where, like the kidneys, that's where, and that innards part, that's where where we would call like your soul, your emotions, those things that make you your person, exist in the Old Testament. That's where those live. And those are the parts of the sacrifice that are brought. So you're sacrificing like the essence is the thing that is given up. And then it as it goes up in the smoke, in the ancient mind, there's this sky plate that is held up on four corners. And we see this like in the book of Revelation, when you see like the four corners and things being held up. That's an image to that sky plate that's held up. And the divine lives above it. And people in the temporal world is beneath it. And people don't go up over the divine. And most of the time in the rest of the ancient Near East, the gods stayed above. That's why ziggurats and temples and everything are so tall, because they're trying to get as close to that sky plate as they can. But there's something about, in the ancient Near East practices, incense or smoke that is able to penetrate that. That is the only way that humans can go above that sky plate into the realm of the divine. It has to be carried in that vehicle of incense, of smoke, there has to be something that carries to break through that barrier. So that's why it's more about the burning and the thing that carries those prayers, those thoughts. That's why that's so important in this sacrifice imagery. It's not about what's being burned, even though sometimes when things are brought and put on the altar, it is that thing that is the essence of in their mind, the essence of personness that is offered, but it is the smoke that takes that essence up that is even more important. than the thing that is brought in the first place. It's getting it from the human up to the divine.
Yeah, I think Michael Morales talks about that it's a transformation from like an earthly substance to a spiritual substance when it turns into smoke. So the earthly substance can't get or be given to God so much, but when it transforms into smoke that goes up and then disappears, they imagine it to be becoming a spiritual substance that can be accepted into God's domain.
But I think that's part of what we see in Revelation when he talks about the bowl of the that is the collection of prayers of the saints. And I think that's part of that imagery that's carried up in through the skyplate into the divine realm, and all of those prayers are collected. And I think that's part of the imagery there, that going up, is then they are collected, and then they're they come back into play in the book of Revelation.
I think I would love you to do an episode on blood and life and nefesh. A lot of people, even though Leviticus is quite explicit, I think that blood is life, still say that, yeah, blood is life, but actually when blood is on the outside, it's death. And therefore, blood, it means death.
I think it's the loss of the nefesh that is the difference between the lifeblood and the death blood.
Yeah. And really quickly, the liver is kaved and soul is kavod. Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And so when they're placing the liver on the altar to give up to God, there must be some kind of thought in Hebrew thought that the two are somehow joined. That they're offering up the soul or the weight, the very being of whatever's associated with the animal up to God. I wrote about that a bit in my book. That fascinates me. But also because I'm a butcher and livers and kidneys is my jam. Yep.
I'm going to circle around, because if there is some talk in these, well, you start with verse 9 to back up one more verse to verse 9 in Hebrews 13. Do not be carried away by varied and strange teachings, for it is good for the heart to be strengthened by grace, not by foods, through which those who were so occupied were not benefited. And then we go into the altar and the offerings, and a lot of the offerings are food-based. Pretty much, most of them are food-based. And I really think I'd like to get Phil's thoughts on this, but that fascinates me, because it goes from the role of the high priest and the priests involved in giving those offerings, and a lot of those pieces that were either not burned outside the camp, but when offerings were brought, the excess after the choice parts were given to God, that was given back to the family. It was given to the family of the priests. It was given to the benefit of the community, because out of God's abundance and overabundance, it's this really interesting cycle, because you got God blessing and giving us overabundance. We give back the best of what we are given in that abundance, and God gives that back again. So it's just this really interesting cycle of blessing versus blessing, and blessing being blessed. And that benefited the entire community. And that was how one of the ways that the poor were cared for, and the widow and the orphan, was in that overflow of the blessing that you received back from the offerings that you brought. You were supposed to share those with anybody, and it was shameful at the end of the night if you had anything left over and that had to be burned. But that was to your disgrace, because you were not generous enough to share out those blessings that you were given back. After you gave your best to God, God took the best of the best, gave back the rest. And that's how the priests would live and bless, and we thrive through that, but also to the sharing of the community and caring for everyone, so everyone could enjoy God's bounty. But in we see it, I think, in Christ, that opens up that table, and everyone has to just direct access to come to this, at the Lord's table, and this banquet that we see in the book of Revelation. Like, that opens that up to everyone. Everyone is able to have access to that food imagery that's going on there. So I really love to hear Phil's thoughts about that.
Yeah, so I just reread Lamb of the Free by Andrew Remington Rillera. And I'm still processing it, but he's quite adamant that, and he's right, that the sin offering isn't eaten by the people. But so he talks about this verse, and I'm still not 100% sure where I land. Like, he's confused me a little bit, I think. So he talks about this section as, yes, we're connected to the altar. So just as people participate, like Paul says, participate in the altar, we participate, or we have an altar that we can participate in. But then he doesn't say that we share in the food, he says we share in the sufferings, which is super interesting. And I think, so what Rillera says, that Hebrews is careful to not talk about the Lord's Supper or the Eucharist or communion, whatever you call it, because Hebrews is focusing on atonement and the priestly role of Jesus, and atoning sacrifices weren't eaten, which is something I hadn't really noticed until I read Lamb of the Free. So I think that's why, and super fascinating, and I'd love to talk about it, but what does it mean to share in Jesus' sufferings, and how is that connected to us participating or sharing in the altar? Yeah, I mean, I have thoughts, but I'm keen to hear what you guys think.
I think it has to do with being faithful to God up until death, whether that's, natural causes, or I think specifically martyrdom. Like, especially in the first century at the time this was written, to be a Christian and to be vocal about it was a dangerous thing to do. And so if you're bold about your faith, you're essentially setting yourself up for ridicule, and possible prison and beatings, and ultimately death. And so if we're going to be faithful servants, then those are the things that we have to be willing to succumb to, if we have to choose between faithfulness to God and not, or not having to endure those things. Like, so if being faithful to God requires us to endure those things, then we're going to be faithful to God. And so I think that's what it has to do with, is imitating Christ in the way that he was bold in his faithfulness all the way up into his last breath.
Yeah, do you have anything, Amber?
Oh, sorry. I didn't realize my mic was all the way over there. So people could actually hear me. That's terrible. I wasn't paying attention. I'm just looking at a couple things that I was pulling up to see. So this one, I have a really interesting collection of commentaries that not a lot of other people look at, just because I really like a different perspective. So there's this one that's a Jewish New Testament commentary written by a really interesting Messianic Jewish scholar, who points out that Hebrews 13, 11 through 14 highlights 5 images. You've got the sin offering, which Jesus suffered death in. It's pulled out of Hebrews 2, 9 and 10. And then you got the impurity that comes up, and separation, because it's moved outside the camp, and Jesus' suffering and death happens outside the camp. And you've also got a reference in there to, if it's the blood of the sacrifice, then that's going to tie back to Hebrews 9:13, which makes reference to the blood of bulls and goats, which is the red heifer, which is interesting. Which that sacrifice, as Phil said, had to be fully, the carcass was burned outside the camp. And then there's a reference to a permanent city, which is the language of 11, 9, and 10, and 11, 9 through, or 13 through 16, and Hebrews 12, 22. So I think it's really interesting. That really, I need to think about that a little bit, because I glanced at that before, but I didn't have a chance to sit and ponder the full, all 5 of those images together, because you don't really see that, but you kind of do. Anyway, that's not very helpful, I'm sure, but but yeah, there's a lot. I mean, there's so much imagery that's stacked on top of each other here that really makes it yeah, and that the suffering piece is really interesting, because the suffering would taint the offering, but it's outside the camp. So the suffering, I don't know. I really don't. I really don't know. I'm just kind of looking at, let's see. There's this other, I don't know which study Bible this is. I have another one open. I'm not sure. I'd have to look and figure that out. It says that this is an early church fathers ancient faith study Bible, which I think those are always interesting notes as well. It says about Hebrews 13, 11, and 12, on the one day of the year when the Holy of Holies could be entered, the Day of Atonement, only the high priest could come in, and then only with the blood of sin offerings. The body of those animals were not eaten, but burned outside the camp. Christ identified with this supreme sacrifice of the Old Testament in that he suffered and died outside the gate. His blood was not carried into the temple in Jerusalem by another human, however. Rather, he carried his own blood into the heavenly most holy place in the eternal today. This is the great entrance of Christ, shows the divine liturgy is eternal, and all under the new covenant members, we are all being members of high priest Jesus Christ, may always enter in. That really, and I don't know. I'm not studied enough in the New Testament to really, I'm just not. Like, this is, I get a lot of what's happening in the imagery in the old, but that why we are suffering equating the suffering with the offering, that's odd. Like, it just to me is interestingly odd, because the suffering was something that was supposed to be prevented in the slaughter of the animal. Leviticus is very clear about that.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you see any, because you could read it that the outside the camp is like the scapegoat being sent outside the camp and into the wilderness, especially because it's within the context of Day of Atonement.
Right. I think there's that. And I also think that there's part of, so one of the really interesting things that Torah does that I think a lot of people miss if you're not looking for it, because there's a misunderstanding of the fact that people think Torah is punitive and is laid out in a courtroom setting, which is not the case. Torah is about God's love, and it is about the preservation of life. And so in that, so like we go back to Exodus and Mount Sinai and the giving of Torah, it starts with God declaring Israel holy, and then he gives them Torah. But all of that Torah is instructions for what? Instructions for they can continue to dwell in his presence. So you have to have a certain level of, I'm going to get myself in trouble here. You have to have a certain level of works to maintain the level of holiness that God has already bestowed. And that is also a process of what we in New Testament world call sanctification, that as you're living out that practice of that holiness and dwelling with Yahweh, it's going to continue to increase your holiness. So that sanctification it's this upward trajectory of holiness increasing as you live that out. And so it's kind of this big fancy word we call praxis, which, those of us who don't use big fancy theological words call spiritual disciplines. As we're implementing those and engaging in the practices of our increasing our faith and trying to dwell with God, that not only helps us to maintain that standard of holiness that we are given to be in God's presence in the first place, but it also helps to refine and burn off some of those drosses. And I think that maybe part of the suffering piece is, for a lot of us, suffering is that piece that keeps us returning to Yahweh and returning to the chesed and the loving kindness, long sufferingness of God. What keeps pushing us back there is that suffering. So I'm wondering about maybe there's a connection there, and that is how we continue in that pursuit. I don't really know exactly. That's where my brain is kind of going, in that direction.
Yeah. One thing to mention is that the sin offering, when it's burned outside the camp, is still holy.
Mm-hmm.
So Leviticus 4, somewhere around verse 12, you shall take the whole offering out, or the bull out beyond the camp to a clean place, to the ash heap, and he shall burn it on the wood with fire. But throughout the whole thing, the priests have to be holy, and if they consume some of the sin offering, they have to consume it in a holy place. And it specifically says that the sin offering is most holy, which is probably holy in the Hebrew. Is it? Is it a
I
double
think
holy?
it might be a double holy. It'd have to look. We might even get a triple holy on that one. But yeah, I think there's at least a double holy there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then even that bit that isn't given to God or used on the altar has to be burned in a holy place outside the camp, so it remains holy. So perhaps the way that we can participate with Jesus' offering of himself is through his suffering. Maybe that's how the writer of Hebrews is understanding it, that like, what can we do to participate in that aspect of his offering? And we can suffer as he did outside the camp. But I find it comforting that whatever it means, we are still holy. So somehow we're participants of the altar. So we are somehow partaking in and participating in Jesus' sacrifice and offering of himself. But in doing that, however we participate, we are holy. Because, as it was burned outside the camp, it remained holy. So if we're sharing his sufferings, we're sharing in that aspect of his offering. So we are holy as we do that.
There is a couple places in 1 Corinthians that talks about this. Like 1 Corinthians 9:13 brings this up. Do you not know that those who perform sacred services eat the food of the temple, and those who attend to the altar have their share from the altar? So the Lord also directed those who proclaim the gospel to get their living from the gospel.
So Rilera would say that because you didn't eat the sin offering, the only way to participate in the sin offering maybe was through the suffering. Maybe, yeah.
And then 1 Corinthians 10:18 is another place where this idea comes up. So I'll back up a couple verses where it says, start at 16. Is not the cup of blessing which we have blessed, which we bless, a sharing in the blood of Christ? Is it not the bread which we break in the sharing of the body of Christ? Since there is one bread, we who are many are one body, for we are all partake of the one bread. Look at the nation of Israel. Are not those who eat the sacrifices sharers in the altar? What do I mean then? Is that a thing sacrificed to idols? So we're talking about sacrificing to idols. So it's a little bit of a different thing. But again, you're not eating the sacrifice, because if it's the sin sacrifice, that wasn't consumed.
Yeah, but either way, he's showing that even the pagan sacrifices understood that they were participating in with the god as sharing in the altar. Yeah.
Right. So that's a puzzling one. See, this is where I have to agree with Jonathan Pritchett that Peter is right and Paul is too complicated sometimes, or whoever wrote Hebrews is in that same category here, because this is a little above my pay grade here, because I don't, the suffering doesn't, but the suffering, the sacrifices were, the animals were killed humanely outside in a holy place. And the part that wasn't sacrificed had to be burned in a holy place. I mean, the holiness is even outside the camp. There was a designated place of holiness. It had to be. So I think that, I wonder if that is tying with, I don't know. I don't know. I don't know.
Yeah. It's still it's still the same offering, which I think whatever Hebrews is trying to say, he's trying to show that we are partakers of Jesus' offering. So the being burned outside the camp is still the sin offering, but it's just it's being made sure. Maybe there was a temptation to take it and eat it or do something with it that would make it unholy. So they're like, no, you need to make sure you've destroyed the whole offering, but it's still holy, so it's got to be in a holy place.
So I'm wondering, because I don't, like, I'm not sure when Hebrews was written, but a lot of these books and epistles were written either in between periods of persecution or during times of persecution. So I'm wondering about the imagery of outside the camp, and even though there's outside the camp, there are still sacred spaces where we meet with God, and that in his suffering and in our suffering is that holy space where we still meet with God, even though that, depending on when Hebrews is written, if the temple is gone or not yet, because it might be, if the temple's gone, if it's written after AD 70, where do we go to meet with God? We meet with God in his suffering.
Well, also, verse 15 talks about sacrifice again. So let us continually, through Jesus. So again, highlighting that through Christ. Therefore, let us continually offer to God a sacrifice of praise, the fruit of lips that confess his name. So whatever it means, we are able to offer a sacrifice of praise, but we are able to participate in Jesus' sacrifice ourselves.
I think it's interesting. You got 15, and then you've got, I don't see the, it just keeps going. There's you got 16.
More.
Do not neglect doing good and sharing, for which with such sacrifices God is pleased. So actions are considered sacrifices, which I would agree with even in the Old Testament. Obey your leaders and submit to them, for they keep watch over your souls as those who give an account. Let them do this with joy and not with grief, for this would be unprofitable for you, meaning a tainted sacrifice, because our actions are part of our sacrifice. And yes, that's really interesting. Pray for us, for we are sure that we have a good conscience, desiring to conduct ourselves honorably in all things. Again, our deeds, just 2 verses above, are linked with our sacrifices, which God is pleased with.
Yeah.
So I'm circling back around to the instructions in Torah, have them living out how they maintain holiness, which God can dwell with them. Like, there's the standard that has to be maintained. So we're saved-based worksationists around here. I think that there has to be, in Hebrew, it does this really interesting thing. The language Hebrew, not the book of Hebrews, or that Hebrew, the language, does this really interesting thing. It will take an abstract concept like faith, and it will inextricably tie it to something that is actually observable, which is works. So faith and works in the Hebrew grammatically are the same thing, really. Faith is the abstract, works is the living out of how you demonstrate that abstract. And you see it in, like, when you put Song of Solomon and you put Ruth in the Tanakh order after Song of Solomon, where it was originally placed when it was put together. The Song of Solomon is metaphor, allegory, this beautiful picture of God, of the loving relationship between God and Israel that he wanted, and that it's in an abstract ideal. That's what it would look like. And then you have the book of Ruth, which is showing us the practical living out of what that looks like. So Ruth is the living out of, and so I'm wondering if that's some of what is happening here, that this suffering is the abstract thought, but it's also through the acts and the deeds and the things that we do, walking through that suffering is the thing that goes up and is pleasing to God, I wonder.
Yeah, is it just a way to connect that abstract, that you can hold on to this abstract or real suffering, but that connects it to the rest of the ritual, the rest of the imagery of sacrifice. So if you're in the midst of suffering, which they probably were, that's a reality that you can take to experience, but that experience will connect you to that sacrificial spiritual reality, maybe. Yeah, that's good.
Yeah, we always get there in the end. We got to go back to the Old Testament to do it.
Yeah. And that's,
yeah.
I've just finished The Lamb of the Free, like I said, and his main thing is that what Jesus did, he didn't do instead of us, he did it ahead of us. And so this, especially this participating or sharing in his suffering, what he did, he suffered not so that we won't, or not so that we don't have to, but so that he's inviting us to share or to take our sufferings and to do it united with him in his suffering. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's as far as my brain's going to tease out that one on the suffering thing. I mean, there are some things that we're just have to, I think, just take on faith as far as we can, and not, some things you just got to let them be what they are, and not get too into the weeds of trying to, make a. We're not making a car manual here. We're trying to do the best we can, walking in faith, I think.
All right. Well, I'd like to kind of provide like my interpretation of this, and then I'd like to kind of get some feedback from you guys. Now, just to give you guys, I'm pretty sure Amber knows where I'm coming from, but Phil might not be familiar with it. But I published a book, and in that book, like I make the argument that the Bible teaches that that no one goes to heaven or hell when they die, but everyone, or like I define hell as the lake of fire or Gehenna. And so no one goes to heaven where God is when they die, or hell, the lake of fire when they die. Those are eternal places, like the places we receive after Judgment Day. And so I believe the Bible teaches that when everybody dies, they go to Sheol or Hades, where they're consciously awaiting the resurrection. And it's exactly the way that Jesus describes it in the parable of the rich man and Lazarus. And so that kind of gives you an idea, like where I'm coming from with this. And so I want to give you my interpretation. And what I'm going to ask is my interpretation consistent with everything you guys just said? Is it consistent with the text? because that's what I'm looking for is consistency. Now, you guys can disagree with me about my conclusion
Mhm.
and still agree that it's consistent. To give you an idea what I mean, like, so let's say I'm arguing that Jesus was born in Nazareth, and so I bring verses to you that, oh, see Jesus here, it describes him as Jesus of Nazareth, and here's a verse over here that calls him the Nazarene. Yeah, those verses are consistent with my conclusion that Jesus was born in Nazareth, but those don't actually teach that there's no, we can't use those verses don't explicitly say that he was born in Nazareth, and then we do have a verse that verses that explicitly teach that he was born in Bethlehem. So since they're so just because I have verses that are consistent with my conclusion, it doesn't necessarily mean the conclusion is true. And so what I'm trying to, um, to flesh out is whether or not my interpretation of this passage is at least consistent. Like I said, it can be, you can disagree with the conclusion. All I'm asking is it consistent? Am I consistently interpreting the text? Okay, so going back to Hebrews 13, when it says, "Consider the outcome of their way of life and imitate their faith," that word "outcome," it's like the end result. So I do believe that is describing, the people before them, their leaders, um, who died, and it's like imitate their faith. Um, and I believe I do believe it. At least some of them were martyred, because we have Stephen. He was martyred, and I believe that was probably around like somewhere in the 30 or the third or fourth century, or third in the 30s or 40s of the first century. Um, so so if we have that idea, like it's imitate, just like you have to be martyred to imitate one's faith, but it's the boldness, that it's that boldness that we're supposed to have, um, that we're going to be faithful to Christ come what may, regardless of how good things get, how bad things get. We're going to be faithful to Christ no matter what. So I think that applies the outcome of their way of life. That would apply whether they're martyred or not. Is just follow their example, imitate their faith. And then it says, so Jesus. Okay, so here's where we get into the whole two altars thing. So verse 10, it says, "We have an altar from which those who serve the tent have no right to eat." So I believe this is talking about the golden altar within the Holy of Holies. What do you guys think about that interpretation?
That can track.
Mhm.
I think,
Yeah.
So that's our first altar. Okay. And then, so I believe when it says, "Therefore, let us go outside the camp and bear the reproach he endured, for here we have," or let me go back one. So Jesus also suffered outside the gate in order to sanctify the people through his blood. Actually, verse 11. "So for the bodies of those animals whose blood is brought into the holy places by the high priest as a sacrifice for sin are burnt outside the camp." Now, when it says burnt outside the camp, is that possibly a reference to the bronze altar?
I wouldn't think so.
Okay.
The burning outside the camp seems specifically that's the same language as the sin offering was burned outside the camp.
Okay, so
Yeah.
then it says sacrifice, that is the fruit of the lips. Okay, so therefore let us go to him outside the camp and bear the reproach he endured. Okay, so would you say the bronze altar is there's would you say there's anywhere in this passage that would fit with the bronze altar?
I Oh boy, I think you've got to, and Phil, I mean, can just agree with me on this, but I think you've got two images at play here. You've got, I think, because the blood in it, the blood that is being brought is the thing that is the bronze altar, but being outside the camp. So I think it's a mixed. To me, it feels kind of like a mixed image. It's got you're outside the camp, but he makes a big point about the blood of the references the blood which is brought into the altar. So I could say possibly that's part of the image that's going on here. That would move the altar outside the camp, which would be really interesting.
Yeah.
So on Day of Atonement, the blood was brought into the most holy place, but the offerings were still on the bronze altar. So if we're talking about a sin offering, that would have been placed on the bronze altar, but then the blood was brought right into the most holy place. And the people didn't eat the sin offering. The priests sometimes did, but only for the people's sins. They didn't eat it for their own, because they couldn't be seen to profit from their own sins. So it could be that they don't have a right to participate from that altar, because if it's a sin offering, you can't eat a sin offering that you've caused, if that makes sense, from uncleanliness that you're trying to purify. So the people never ate a sin offering. So the people could never participate or eat from the bronze altar if it was a sin offering. But perhaps now we can, because we are all priests.
Right. What do you think about this, Phil? Because they could only enter the Holy of Holies on the Day of Atonement. But every morning and every evening, when the sacrifices were made on behalf of the people, the curtain was opened so that God could participate in those, and then, but no one went in. So you could still see from the bronze altar, when the morning and evening sacrifices were made, you could see into the ark 2 times a day when those, on behalf of the people, those offerings were made.
Is that right? I didn't know that.
I think so. Yeah. Courtney's made a big point about that several times in conversations that I've had with her. So that's Courtney. So if it's wrong, you can go, I'll like I'm quoting Courtney here, but I think so. I agree with her that I think that's some of the imagery that's going on there, but yeah, because you could only enter, but that didn't stop them from opening so that God could enjoy the participating in the process of the offerings happening. And then the smoke goes up and he gets the full process of the sacrifices.
I wonder, is it what you're saying, Stephen, that now that we can participate through the suffering, that we are actually connected to the most holy place, whereas before we couldn't be connected with either altar if it was a sin offering. But he's just created a way that we can share in the suffering, even though it's not eating. We are connected to the altar, even though conceptually there was no real way to be connected to the altar, because you didn't eat the sin offering. I'm just thinking through this on the fly.
Yeah, it is complicated, because it's like are we eating the sin offering, or are we the sin offering? Like because we're joining him where he was offered and partaking in his offering. Like he was offered outside the camp, and we must meet him outside the camp to also be offered, in a sense. And so I believe it's referring to martyrdom. And so that's what it talks about. Like it's the whole imitating him, imitating his life. Because he was, like I said, he was faithful up until death, up until his last breath. And so we must imitate that kind of faithfulness.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. Yeah. And that's what was acceptable about his offering, is that he can be seen as a martyr, like he's obedient to death.
Yeah.
And how do we participate in that? Yeah, be obedient to death, and that's what love looks like ultimately. Yeah. That makes sense to me.
Yeah, because it's saying we must bear the reproach he endured. Well, the reproach he endured was offering his life to God.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to read a quote from Victorinus. This is his commentary on Revelation 6:9, and what he does is he connects it with the bronze altar and Jesus's description of the rich man and Lazarus. So he wrote, the bronze altar refers to the earth, under which is Hades. This is a region away from punishments and fires. It is a place of rest for the saints. Here indeed the wicked see the righteous, but they cannot be carried across to them, describing that chasm that Jesus described. And so if we keep this image in mind, that if it's the bronze altar, like we're like Jesus, we're offering ourselves through martyrdom, faithfulness to God, because there's no greater love than this, for a man to lay his life down for a friend. And so that it's showing that our love for God is so strong and so bold that we are willing to lay our lives down for him. And so again, it's not a requirement, obviously. Like no one's required. Like it's not like if you don't die a martyr's death, then you're not saved. We have to have that type of boldness. So or that conviction and faithfulness to God, that even if it came to it, that we would remain faithful. But yeah, it's so what do you think about that? Like the altar in Revelation 6:9-11, where it describes the saints under the altar who were martyred, asking for when their blood will be avenged.
Can I take that and change it slightly? So I think he was connecting the bronze altar to death. So just as you were reading that, I was like, outside the camp is the place of death. The bronze altar is the place where everyone could go, kind of like associate that with earth. And then the most holy place is the spiritual, if you're thinking about the 3-tiered cosmology. So if outside the camp is the underworld or death or Sheol, which is where Jesus suffered and died, and where we can go, and if you're saying martyrdom, that makes sense. So we can be connected to the spiritual, to the most holy place, by participating in death. Does that make sense? So you've got the 3: death outside, Sheol, the common place in the middle where everyone can go and participate and eat, and then the most holy place where only God and the high priest could go. But now, if we go outside the camp to share in his sufferings, we are connected to the most holy place. So we've bridged that. We've become united with God, which is the goal of the Bible, which is the goal of life.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering about that. If it, because I mean, I don't disagree with what you're saying. I'm just trying to think that through a little bit, because
it's getting a little bit Jonathan Peugeot.
we are a little bit, but I'm just wondering about, because the souls are gathered or waiting under the altar, and that wouldn't be the gold altar in the Holy of Holies. I don't think. because
Yeah, I don't know about that bit.
if they're waiting in Sheol, that would be the outside the camp. So it would be the holy place outside the camp, which I'm wondering if they're trying to tie the cross to the bronze altar. I'm wondering about that. Like if that's where the connection is, or because I don't disagree with you. I'm just trying to like wrap my head around it. I'm just I don't know. That's all I can say really is I don't know. I don't
Yeah, 'cause
necessarily. I don't
the,
think you're
the,
wrong. I
the
just can't.
phrasing of outside the camp and
Yeah.
where the bronze altar is in relation to the camp is what makes it kind of difficult. Is that because
Well,
to me,
no, I mean, the part that makes it interesting to think about the imagery when you think about, you've got Day of Atonement language in there and the imagery of Day of Atonement. And that was the one day that they were entered into the Holy of Holies. But in the morning and evening sacrifices, the curtain was opened so you could see from one altar to the other. And and if we're saying that somehow the crucifixion ties to the bronze altar imagery, and then the saints are waiting under the bronze altar and not the gold altar, that kind of tracks in certain views that I know a lot of the early church fathers were really big on agreeing with the concept of Sheol type place of waiting. And so you're waiting outside the camp, but it's under the altar. So it would track with the being a clean space, maybe not a holy space, but a clean space. And then that in the divine realm, God is watching from the gold altar to the bronze altar, because in the sacrifices he could see the morning and evening. I don't know. I don't know. I just don't know. I don't think you're wrong. I'm just still trying to figure out a way overcomplicated, probably, I'm sure. I don't know.
Yeah, I need to look more into the Day of Atonement, like the wording that's used, like the Hebrew for Day of Atonement,
Mhm.
because I know in the Old Testament, the two sides of Sheol or Hades, they're all often referred to as either the day or the night. And so I'm just because Day of Atonement, and if day is, you said that um, the curtain was open on the Day of the Atonement. I wonder if there's any connection with the way that the word day is used in relation to the dead, but those who are bodily dead but present with the Lord.
I don't know about that at all. I know that Day of Atonement is very clear in the Old Testament of what it's for and how it works, and it's absolutely explicit that the blood of the first goat cleanses the meeting space. It resets the space for God to dwell with his people for another year. It cleanses Israel. It gives them a reboot back to the first day that he declares them holy when they're given Torah. It resets them there, and everything that they've accumulated in the year previously that would make it so that God Yahweh couldn't dwell with them anymore, that is put on the second goat, and that goat is sent back where it goes out to the wilderness. And I think that imagery is very much, you got Azazel, and that is the weight of sin collective going back where it belongs, to the one who brought sin into the world in the first place, that is taken back where it goes, and eventually that will be held to account in the final day of the Lord, that continuing rolling collection of the piling on and the accounting of the sin as it continues to be a problem in the world, that keeps getting piled there. That Day of Atonement thing and that second goat, the scapegoat is, I have a real problem with people trying to make Jesus the scapegoat, because that makes him sin in a way that is the pack mule. I can't get there, because that second goat takes that sin back where it belongs, and sin doesn't belong with Jesus. Jesus isn't the originator of sin. So Day of Atonement language is extremely clear about that what it does is a national reboot and sends the burden for the responsibility for the national collective sin as a whole, sends it back where it belongs, to the originator. And so I don't know.
That's why I don't think Hebrews is talking about Day of Atonement and the goat for Azazel. Because we couldn't participate in that. We couldn't participate in removing sin or carrying sin away.
Yeah.
But I know the Bible doesn't often associate Jesus with the scapegoat, but I think in places it does. But I think that he can do it because he's like, sin can't stick to him. He doesn't get contaminated. He touches something impure, he doesn't become impure. He's like a Teflon coated Jesus.
Isn't it in Hebrews where it says death couldn't hold him?
Well, I think that goes back to Ezekiel 36, 37, that we need a different kind of human. Like you take, like, humans are Gandalf the Gray and Jesus is Gandalf the White. Like, he is so leveled up that there's that makes it so that there is that whatever it is in us that makes us sin stick to us, Jesus is removed from.
Yeah.
And the only reason why the fulfillment of the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus works is Ezekiel 37, because of that spirit process that transforms us from, which is why Romans goes back to Romans 5, why we're not accountable to the law, and when we are born in Christ, because of that spirit. Ezekiel 37, we are taken from the body, we're taken from the flesh and reborn in the spirit, which is the same thing that's happening, I think, in the resurrection, that is brought out. So you see now, this is why I like you, Stephen. You get around to Ezekiel eventually. That's my favorite chapter in the Bible, is Ezekiel 37. It's the peek behind the curtain of how the whole thing works. Is we're not under the law anymore. Why? Because as Christians in the blood of Christ, we are not in the carnal. We are reborn in the spirit. So we follow the law and the instructions of how to live in holiness in Torah. Why? Not because we're required, because we're carnal, but because in the spirit we do so out of a desire to love and dwell with God, and we want to maintain that. And that's why in Ezekiel 37 is so important, I think, here too, because that is that transformational piece.
Can I, just as you're talking, can I Jonathan Peugeot it again? and that could also work for Hebrews if we, to get to the spiritual, to get to the most holy place, the only way to get there is to go through death. And if we do it participating in Jesus' death, so if we go back from the earthly, we go to the place of suffering and united in Jesus' death, that brings us, that connects us to the most holy place that we couldn't otherwise get to. Does that fit with what you're seeing in, the being reborn into, like, the only way to be reborn is through death?
Yeah. Because it makes it very clear. We start with an Israel that's so, that imagery there, I mean, that's not a fresh pile of bodies there. That is dusty, dry bones that are crumbling. They are dead. There is no more dead that you can get than that. There's nothing on them. They're just bones that are turning to dust. They're so dry and dead. And those are brought back with a ruach, comes in and recreates them. It's recreation language. They're stitched back together. They're given all of the fleshy parts that have been gone for a long, long time, and given a new ruach in the new spirit through. And how does that work? Christ brings that through the blood of the Christ sacrifice, moves us from that carnal into that new dwelling in that ruach. And you don't get there until you get to the cross, and to the resurrection is the thing that does it.
This has been great. I love this.
Yeah, I knew with you guys it would be a great discussion, because you both have very nuanced views, and you're very well studied, especially when it comes to the Old Testament, and that's probably the weakest. And so I definitely learn a lot from you guys.
I think Phil is really versed in the sacrificial system and how all of that works, which is the foundation of Torah. And then you got to put the prophets on that, which are the interpreters of Torah. And then you get to the New Testament. But so I saw somebody make a comment earlier about the New Testament interpreting the Old Testament, which I'm going to push back on that a little bit, because if you don't understand the Old Testament imagery, you don't understand the New Testament to understand the Old Testament. You have to understand where it starts to be able to use the New Testament to go back and understand what's happening, is the fulfillment of it. So if you don't understand Torah, everything else is wrong. You have to understand Torah to understand the New Testament. And then if you understand the New Testament, because you understand Torah, then you understand the whole Christophanies and everything that's going on with the imagery of Christ in Ezekiel 37, and why that matters so much, because you have to understand Torah to understand the New Testament, to understand the Old Testament. It's kind of a cycle that keeps going back and forth on itself.
I wanted to ask you, because you spoke with Courtney recently, and I wanted to ask you about how, I think I saw the same comment that you saw. What people, I don't know when it was, but Reformation, Middle Ages, they started interpreting sacrifice through Jesus without ever having seen a sacrifice performed. So they looked at Jesus, they're like, oh, he suffered a lot, and then he died. That must be what a sacrifice is. And then they go back and read Leviticus, they're like, oh, well, that must be that the animal suffered, and it must be all about the death. But it's actually not. But that's what you were talking about. How does that work with interpreting the old through the new? But then you have to go back and interpret the old through the new, but you've got to get the old
It's a little bit of both.
Yeah.
Right. I think, well, and I think here's okay, this is my like 2-minute spiel on theology. Okay. So theology is reactionary. It is reacting to the time and place, the context in which it comes out of. So if your theology comes from the early church, that is their closest, and their theology is being developed in the time which all of this is happening. And then as you go, each era in the progression of theology is a reaction to what's happening. So, the Reformation, we get there because the world shifts into satisfaction culture, and you are obligated to protect the honor of your overlord, your master, most people are poor little serfs who have not a lot of control over their lives, and everything they do reflects upon your lord, your liege, your whoever is over you. And in that frame of mind, when something that you do is an offense that has to be answered, because that is an offense that is an honor, a mark against your honor that has to be quote unquote satisfied, responded to, and something has to be done to make up for that somehow. if that's the way you understand the world, and you go back and look at, okay, so sacrifice has to mean that this is payment for offending the honor of God. This is payment in a courtroom like you get like Anselm and some of these guys who really get, but they're so in that reacting in that time, in that context. So what they did makes sense then, but doesn't make sense now because we don't live in that context now. So every time you see a shift in theology, you have to stop and you have to ask yourself, what's happening then that they're dealing with then that makes them think that way? Because theology is reactionary. It just is. And anybody who wants to say differently probably needs to pay a little bit more attention to history, because every time there's a shift, something major is going on in culture around them. And you can track it, what's happening in culture with the reaction that theology is having. Sometimes it takes them a little while to catch up, but it's always a reaction to the culture and time in which it's being developed. So it's never purely neutral or objective, because it's always a reaction to, oh, this is a new thing in culture. How do we deal with this? This is a new way of thinking in culture. How do we deal with this? It's always a response. It's always reactionary. So you have to be careful to understand what's happening in the time and culture and place, to understand how they got there and how they started to think that way. So that's my 3-minute spiel on theology.
Yeah.
I like it. All right. Well, I guess it's been an hour and a half, so we should probably wrap it up here. Yeah, I really enjoyed this conversation. I knew you guys would deliver. I just enjoy listening to you guys. I feel like I'm just here learning. But yeah, we've got to do this again sometime. Go ahead and both of you, if you guys have anything coming up, just let everybody know.
I'll let Phil go first. Go ahead, Phil.
I don't have a date, but I have a book coming out, being published through Whitford Stock. So they have it. I'm just waiting for some illustrations and some editing. So hopefully I'll have a date soon, and hopefully this year. But yeah, that's coming up. But yeah, Leviticus is fun. On YouTube is where you can find me, and I'll be updating.
All right,
through
I'll be
there.
getting that book when it comes out.
Yeah,
I know. I can't wait. I'm gonna buy an extra one to mail to Phil to autograph for me so he can send it back. Because I'm so excited about that book, man. I'm just like, there's not a lot of books that I get really excited about coming out, but Phil's, man, that's on my list to jump to the top of the list when I get it. I'm really excited about that. Me, I'm all over the place. Holy moly. So I've got some stuff coming out. So we've got later on this evening, I've got Spencer Owen joining me, and we're going to talk about how do we read the hard parts of the Bible, especially in the Old Testament, because there's genocide and war and all kinds of sexual violence and just all kinds of ickiness that is going on there. So he and I are going to have a conversation about what do we do with all of that. Leviticus, why Leviticus Matters Part 2 is in the works, and I'm really excited about it. I think we got it scheduled. I think we have a date for that scheduled, so I'm really excited because that's going to be get the Levitic geeks together again, and we're going to nerd out on Leviticus some more. And then I hit 300 from my appearance on Soteriology 101. So tomorrow we're having a 300 subscriber party where some people are going to be some real fun people that are going to be stopping by. And Stephen is supposed to be one of them. He's supposed to come by and say hi. So I got, I know I've got a few people confirmed, but I don't want to, say who they are in case they decide not to show up and then I publicly shame them later. But, that'll be fun. And Old Testament questions, except the Nephilim. I'm not answering any questions about the Nephilim. So we're just not even going to, let's just put that out there right there. And then Faith Unaltered, I've got with Courtney, we have the Hebrew Bible breakdown that has started. And next episode, we're going to look at comparing historical critical criticism method and canonical narrative, which is my favorite narrative of interpretation and hermeneutic. So we're going to compare and contrast those and tear those apart, and that'll be, and then we're just going to dig into canon, how the canon developed, how just there's a bunch of stuff we're going to talk about, how Hebrew thinks. We're going to talk about the ancient Near East culture. We're going to just get into all those mechanics of how do we better understand scholarship and how do we better understand the Old Testament. So a lot of good stuff coming out with that one. And I've also on Faith Unaltered, we're doing a big thing called the Ecclesia Project. We're going to talk about the church. How do we be a little more ecumenically charitable? How do we get along a little better? And then we're going to wrap that up with a multi-part conversation on how do we coexist with irreconcilable differences, because certain traditions just hold positions that are not reconcilable, and how do we handle that, and how do we get along better even though we have those irreconcilable differences, some of us. So a lot of really big stuff. It's going to be a really busy rest of the semester because I'm still a full-time student at the same time, so trying to do all that and keep up with all my work, working on my thesis proposal this semester, and next year is my thesis year. So that is also looming on the horizon. But yeah, you can find me on When Deep Calls Deep and on Faith Unaltered. I'm on both. So, yep.
All right. Thank you guys. I really enjoyed this discussion. I'll have to probably rewatch it again to pick up on some more things. All right. Well, thank you guys again, and God bless you.
All right. Thanks, Stephen. It's good to see you, Phil. Leviticus Matters Part 2. I'm really excited about that.
All right. Thanks, everyone. It's a good chat.
Bye.
Bye.
All right.
Yeah,
right.
that was good.
Yeah, I enjoyed it.
Yep. Well, I got to go. My family is descending at any minute. So, oops.
All right. All right. Well, thanks again.
All right. Thanks, Stephen. Take care.
You too. Bye.